So back in the spring of 2026, the world was holding its breath. The United States and Iran were spiraling towards what really looked like an unavoidable war. This is the story of how ultimatums, military standoffs, and some very secret diplomacy brought an entire region right to the very edge of disaster. And let me tell you, this wasn't just some fringe talk. By early April 2026, the rhetoric coming out of Washington was getting harder and harder by the hour. This quote, from the head of the Senate Armed Services Committee, no less, really captured this growing feeling that a military solution was the only way forward. War didn't just seem possible. For a lot of people, it felt inevitable. But just as the entire world was bracing for impact, something changed. With less than 60 minutes to go before the U.S. was set to begin military action, Washington and Tehran somehow agreed to a ceasefire. It was this incredibly dramatic, last-second reversal that pulled everyone back from the brink. Okay, so that 11th hour deal brought this huge collective sigh of relief, right? But it left a massive question just hanging in the air. How on earth did things get so dangerous so fast? To really understand the fragile truce that came next, we have to go back and unpack the chain of events that almost led to a full-blown war. So this crisis, it didn't just pop up out of nowhere. It was really the climax of years of hostility, a series of moves and countermoves that pushed both countries further and further down a path towards open conflict. Now, what's really interesting here is just how quickly this all escalated. It really kicked off in February, when these high-stakes nuclear talks in Geneva completely fell apart. The U.S. was demanding that Iran dismantle its key nuclear facilities and hand over all its enriched uranium. Iran said absolutely not. So, in retaliation for sanctions, Tehran made its big move in late March. They shut down the Strait of Hormuz. And that one act triggered a massive U.S. military deployment and a final ultimatum. In just a matter of weeks, a diplomatic failure had turned into a full-on military standoff. Iran's decision to close the strait, that was the move that really lit the fuse. And to get why it was such a big deal, you have to understand that the Strait of Hormuz isn't just some local waterway. You could argue it's the single most important choke point for the entire global economy. Think about this number for a second. 20%. About a fifth of the whole world's oil supply has to pass through this one narrow channel. So when Iran closed it, it wasn't just a military tactic. It was a direct threat to the global energy supply and, the stability of the entire world economy. So here's the situation. You've got two rivals on a collision course, a global economy starting to panic, and they've completely cut off direct communication. With the clock ticking down, the world was just desperately looking for an off-ramp, for anyone who could break that dangerous silence. And this was the fundamental problem, right? How do you de-escalate a crisis when the two main parties refuse to even talk to each other? The official lines were dead. Somebody had to step into that void and try to build a bridge. And then a pretty unlikely mediator shows up. Pakistan decided to step into the middle of it all, trying to use its unique position of having decent relationships with both Tehran and Washington to broker some kind of peace. And this wasn't just a casual phone call. Iran's foreign minister, Abbas Araghchi, he flew directly to Islamabad. His mission? To lay out Iran's official terms for what they were calling war negotiations. Basically, Iran was using Pakistan as this trusted go-between to send, as one source put it, secret messages. They were trying to feel out if the U.S. had any real interest in de-escalation. And pretty quickly, this back channel became the only real path away from war. So while all these secret talks are happening, the economic damage from the standoff was already hitting the world and hitting it hard. This wasn't some distant political drama. The fallout was immediate, it was global, and you could feel it. And this chart, well, it just perfectly illustrates the stakes. With the Strait of Hormuz shut down, analysts were predicting oil prices could shoot past $200 a barrel. A spike like that would have been absolutely catastrophic, and it threatened to trigger a really severe global recession. The entire world was feeling the pressure. The crisis just threw global logistics into total chaos. Insurance costs for any ships even heading towards the Gulf went through the roof. Companies were so desperate to avoid delays that some were paying as much as $4 million for a single slot to cut the line at the Panama Canal. And here in the US, the average price for a gallon of gas climbed over $4. It was a pretty stark reminder that a conflict in one tiny waterway can be felt in your wallet half a world away. That ceasefire, announced in the early hours of April 8th, it brought this huge wave of relief across the globe. But it didn't bring peace. What it did was create a new, very tense, and incredibly uncertain reality. And this is where things get really complicated. Iran agreed to let ships pass through the strait, so it's technically open. But at the exact same time, the U.S. kept a full naval blockade in place. So what does that mean? It means ships could pass through the strait, but no ships could travel to or from any Iranian ports. Let's be really clear here, a naval blockade is not a sanction. Under international law, it is considered an act of war. The U.S. formally announced its blockade on April 12th, and it was enforced by this huge force of over 16 warships and 100 aircraft. They effectively sealed Iran off from all trade by sea. And, a blockade isn't as simple as just parking some ships in the water. It's a formal military action with a very strict set of internationally recognized rules. You have to declare it, it has to actually work, and you have to apply it impartially to ships from every country. There are also really clear limits to prevent it from causing a humanitarian disaster. President Trump's statement made the whole strategy crystal clear. The blockade wasn't just some leftover from the near conflict, it was now being used as an active bargaining chip. The U.S. position was simple. The economic pressure on Tehran is going to continue until a final deal is done. And this, right here, is the core of the whole problem. When you actually look at what both sides want, you just see how incredibly far apart they are. The U.S. is demanding the complete takedown of Iran's nuclear program and wants all their enriched uranium. Meanwhile, Iran's 10-point plan is demanding security guarantees, recognition of its right to enrich uranium, and the lifting of all sanctions. On the biggest issues, they are just worlds apart. So that brings us to the ultimate question. The ceasefire stopped the shooting, but the blockade keeps the state of economic war going. As one analyst warned, this fragile truce isn't a solution, it's just a rest. And it leaves the entire world holding its breath, wondering if this is the start of a real peace or if it's just a quiet moment before the storm comes back.